Glad to be back with you all tonight. I'll be honest, this isn't going to be the usual kind of missions message. But just being here this morning, the Lord kind of burdened my heart with what I hope is going to be an encouraging message. But I'll be honest, it comes across as probably not going to sound all that encouraging at times. Let's turn over to Hebrews chapter 11. And this is the Hall of Faith. This is actually, I call this my life chapter. Because in my time at Heartland, in one semester, I was preached to out of this chapter 8 or 9 times. And I kind of added it up and looked at all the different places I was preached at from this passage. And I was the only one that would have been there for all 8 of them. And most other people at Heartland would have only gotten 2 or 3 at most. So I kind of looked at it and said, maybe the Lord's got something in here for me. And I did a deep dive study into it and just fell in love with this passage. But we're going to be looking at a question that every child of God is going to have to answer. Another area I was thinking about going to tonight was a question that everyone has to answer, and that's who is Jesus Christ. I think we covered that a good bit this morning. But so tonight we're looking at a question that every Christian has to answer, and that is, are you going to choose affliction or the pleasures of sin? So starting in verse 23, it says, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents, because they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. By faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt. But he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Through faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, which the Egyptians, essaying to do, were drowned. Now when it starts there, that first verse I read there in verse 23, I'll be honest, when I used to read this as a kid, I would just kind of go through it, and I didn't understand who that passage was talking about. By faith Moses, when he was born. Who is that actually talking about? His parents. That passage is about the faith of Moses' parents, who they had a choice. They could choose to obey the king's command, or they could disobey it and possibly face consequences from the king. Because back in those days, if you disobeyed the king, guess what? Off with your head. And yet they said they were not afraid of those consequences. And then the next verse, verse 24, now we're talking about Moses, when it says, by faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. So there's going to come a time in each and every Christian's life, and if we're honest, there's probably going to come time after time after time where we have to make that choice. Am I going to continue serving the Lord? Am I going to continue on the path that God has set me on, or am I going to turn aside? And you know what? Moses didn't have any illusions as to what that decision was. One of the things they say is the difference between a false prophet, and we'll see this later on, we're going to be in Jeremiah briefly, but one of the big differences between a false prophet and one telling the truth is a true prophet is not going to cover up the ugly bits. We see in Jeremiah, later on we'll see where there's a prophet, a high priest, that he says all these bad things that God says is going to happen, they're not going to happen. It's all good. It's all going to be good. And we see that in our nation today. You can go to many, many teachers and pastors in this world that will tell you that God never has anything bad for you in your life, that you're not going to hit those road bumps, that the afflictions aren't going to come. And they'll try to tell you that, hey, it's all smooth sailing, and if anything goes wrong, it's because you're not seeking God the way He wants it. But the reality is, is that when we seek God, when we follow after God, there will be afflictions. No ifs, ands, or buts. This is kind of the reason why I was saying this. I hope it's going to be an encouraging message, but Scripture does not sugarcoat things. We live in a world that has been cursed by sin. When Adam and Eve ate of that fruit, when they turned against God and rejected Him in their rebellion, this is the result. We live in an ugly world. I've got a brother who was in the Navy as a Navy corpsman. He's a medic, basically. And he was attached to a Marine platoon in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. And he's told me some of the things he's seen. And it was ugly. He's seen the very, very worst that this world has to offer. Children dying. His friends dying in his hands. You know what? We're not exempt. But we have a choice. We can try to put our heads in the sand and choose sin and choose the easy path, or what looks like the easy path. But at the end of every path is sorrow. Every path outside of God. It might start off easy. It might start off fun. And that's the choice that Moses had. He had the entire world at his fingertips. Egypt in his day was the wealthiest country in the entire world. And he was at the top of the wealthiest country in the world. Just look at our millionaires and billionaires in our nation today and how they seem to have everything at their fingertips. That's where Moses was. If he wanted it, snap his fingers and somebody's going to jump and bring it to him. And he could have lived a life in this world that was easygoing. He would not even have had to lift his fingers, his hands, to dress himself. That's how easy he had it. Just snap his fingers and there's servants. And yet Moses looked at that and he said, I have a path before me and I don't even have to do anything for it. I can just take the easy road. I can just continue on in the family that raised me. Or I can choose God's people. I can choose affliction. Because there's a difference. The path that's easy, I've seen so many friends that have gone down that path, family members that have gone down that path, and at the end of it, it's always bad. Death and hell. Or some sins I've seen. A family friend of ours was an alcoholic and a drunkard. His path of ease ended with him dying, living in a hole in the ground. He got pneumonia from being in a storm out, literally living in a hole in the ground. Not where he thought he'd end up. But Moses is looking at this and he's saying, I will choose the reproach of Christ because the riches of Jesus Christ are greater riches than Egypt. There it says in verse 26. That what we have in Jesus Christ, you know what, from a worldly perspective, it's going to look hard. I can look at my home church. We've been through a very rough year. Last summer, things seemed to be going great. We had attendance was up. People were getting saved. People were getting baptized. And it seemed like within just a month or two that everything fell apart. And we had the key member of our church, Mrs. Greer. I don't know, did you know Brother Chadwick? Chris Chadwick? It's his mother-in-law. His wife Debbie's from my home church. And he's a preacher there in San Diego. But Mrs. Greer was diagnosed with terminal cancer. At the same time, within about a week of that, a young lady, and I say young, she's my age, 38, graduated high school with her, and she was diagnosed with cancer in her mouth. At the same time, my pastor got valley fever, which I don't know if you all have that. I don't think you'll have that up here. Valley fever is a fungus that gets in you, and basically you have it for the rest of your life. And if it can kill you. And valley fever knocked him flat. So right when the church needed him to be strong, here is a sickness that just came in and it seemed out of nowhere. And one thing after another, and I'm just scratching the surface. So when, brother, you were talking about the rough times you're going through, I was right there with you. And as we travel deputation, you know what, just to be transparent, it's not all sunshine and roses. There's times where I've been on the side of the road, had my RV dug into the ground this deep to the axles and going, what do I do? And here I've got my kids and my family and things, and just one thing after another. Sometimes it just seems like we have those seasons, doesn't it? Where the hard times come. That's the reality of choosing God. I know that doesn't sound too encouraging. But there's a difference. Because when you're in the world and you've chosen the pleasures of sin, and you've gone after the ways of sin, the hard times come eventually. And you have no one there with you. But when you choose Jesus Christ, He's going to take you on a path that is going to lead to hard times. Because guess what? We're in a sin-cursed world. You know, in God's plan, His best plan for humanity, none of this would have ever happened. But it didn't catch Him off guard that Adam and Eve were going to sin and that all of these things were going to happen. And He was looking ahead and He was seeing us. And He's saying, okay, well, I want to save Randy Brown, and I want to save Brother Matt, and I want to save Brother Fred, Brother Nick. And He's looking ahead. And He's saying, I could stop it with Adam and Eve. You know what? Because He could have brought judgment right then and there. And all the afflictions of this world would have gone, never happened. But Jesus Christ is looking at that, and He's looking ahead and saying, but if I stop the sin here, if I stop all the bad things that could ever happen in this world, right there at Adam and Eve, how much good, where would we be? And He was looking ahead to us and saying, I love them. And when we serve Him, guess what? Those hard times come. But we have Jesus Christ walking with us every step of the way. And you know what? We're not unique in getting discouraged. Let's look over, I mentioned we were going to look in Jeremiah chapter 20. Because can I tell you, none of us are above discouragement. Had the chance to see my pastor last week. We were back in Bakersfield. And with everything going on in the church, everything that seemed to be going the wrong direction, we have a Christian school that is down to 2 students. My kids were like half the school when we were there. And because of all these health issues, that young lady that got the mouth cancer, she's one of the teachers, and she's just thriving there. But then going through chemo, she can't do some of the things that need to be done. And just yesterday morning, they were going out and handing out a bunch of flyers. He had a goal of handing out 5,000 flyers to try to get some students into the school so we can spread the gospel to them. But the reality is, you know what, that might not go anywhere. And we might have to shut down the school. That's what we're looking at. So, I mean, it's one thing after another. And he was telling me in a moment that he had those moments in the night where he wondered, is he the right man? He had wondered, am I doing the right things? Jeremiah here in chapter 20. Jeremiah has come out and he's preached and he's told them the truth that guess what? Judgment is coming. And I mentioned that there's those false prophets. And in verse 1 of chapter 20, it says, Now Pashur, the son of Emer, the priest, who was also chief governor in the house of the Lord, heard that Jeremiah prophesied these things. Then Pashur smote Jeremiah the prophet and put him in the stocks that were in the high gate of Benjamin, which was by the house of the Lord. And it came to pass on the morrow that Pashur brought forth Jeremiah out of the stocks. Then said Jeremiah unto him, The Lord hath not called thy name Pashur, but Magor-Missabib. For thus saith the Lord, Behold, I will make thee a terror to thyself and to all thy friends, and they shall fall by the sword of their enemies, and thine eyes shall behold it. And I will give all Judah into the hand of the king of Babylon, and he shall carry them captive into Babylon, and shall slay them with the sword. Moreover, I will deliver all the strength of this city, and all the labors thereof, and the treasures of the kings of Judah will I give into the hand of their enemies, which shall spoil them, and take them, and carry them to Babylon. And thou, Pashur, and all that dwell in thine house, shall go into captivity, and thou shalt come to Babylon, and there thou shalt die, and shalt be buried there, thou and all thy friends, to whom thou hast prophesied lies. You know what Jeremiah's recompense for telling them the truth? He got put in prison, and he got a beating. And can I tell you, their prisons were not like our prisons. He didn't get 3 square meals a day and TV time. If he was lucky, somebody on the outside might bring him a morsel. Quite often, people went in there and died and didn't ever come out in the dark, dank dungeons that they would throw them in. And then they bring him out and they beat the tar out of him. Does that seem like a good reward for telling people and warning them of their fate? Yet that's what happened to him. And they'll go on to continue to persecute him and continue to belittle him and continue to ridicule him. Look there in verse 7. It says, O Lord, thou hast deceived me, and I was deceived. Thou art stronger than I, and hast prevailed. I am in derision daily, and everyone mocketh me. For since I spake, I cried out, I cried violence and spoil, because the word of the Lord was made a reproach unto me, and a derision daily. Then I said, I will not make mention of him, nor speak any more in his name. That's a low point. Jeremiah had a clear call from God, a clear task from God, and he carried it out faithfully. Not only does he get thrown in prison and he gets beaten when they let him out, guess what? Everybody goes around and speaks negatively about him, and they mock him. And they continue to give him a hard time. Look at verse 10, and we'll go back to the second half of verse 9, but look at verse 10. It says, For I heard the defaming of many, fear on every side. Report, say they, and we will report it. All my familiars watch for my halting, saying, Peradventure he will be enticed, and we shall prevail against him, and we shall take our revenge on him. That word there, when it says fear on every side, they were kind of giving him a nickname. That was kind of what they're saying about. They're saying, oh, you're fear. You're just a fear monger. He gets discouraged. And he says, I'm not going to do it anymore. I'm going to turn aside. You ever been there? I have. I've had times where it seems like everything's going wrong. And you just want to quit. And you wonder, why am I doing this? Is it really worth serving the Lord to go through what I'm going through? Look on the other half there of verse 9. It says, But his word was in mine heart as a burning fire shut up in my bones, and I was weary with forbearing, and I could not stay. He has called us to the greatest task this world has ever seen that can be carried out by mortal men. We have the privilege to carry the gospel to the lost. I can't remember if it was Brother Woodcock this Friday at Silver State. He was talking about how, when we're in heaven and we get to go and we can see Moses and ask him, hey, how was the crossing of the Red Sea? What was that like? What was it like to see God on the mount and to see God do the Ten Commandments and to see the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud. How was that? And how was it to, if you could, when you get to talk to Joshua and hear about all the things he got to see as they went into the promised land, and we could go on. And all these people that saw the miracles of God, and he said, you know what? The reality is what they're going to say is, what was it like having the Holy Spirit inside of you? We have been called to a time, if you're saved, you have something that the Moses didn't have, Abraham didn't have it, David didn't have it. On down the list of all the Old Testament saints, they did not have the Holy Spirit residing in them as we who have the privilege to live in this day and age get to live. We have been called to something special. But that doesn't mean we're above discouragement. When Jeremiah was discouraged and he wanted to give up, it's when the Lord stirred up the calling in his life. That's when the words, he couldn't help but speak the words of the Lord. When they were going through his mind, and the Lord encouraged him. And, to be honest, he still had a very hard ministry, didn't he? I mean, we haven't even gotten into Lamentations. Let's turn over to Psalms chapter 13, or the 13th Psalm. This is a psalm of David as he's being chased by his enemies through the wilderness. It says, "How long wilt thou forget me, O Lord, forever? How long wilt thou hide thy face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart daily? How long shall mine enemy be exalted over me? Consider and hear me, O Lord my God. Lighten mine eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. Lest my enemy say, I have prevailed against him. And those that trouble me rejoice when I am moved. But I have trusted in thy mercy. My heart shall rejoice in thy salvation. I will sing unto the Lord, because he hath dealt bountifully with me." David's a good example of someone who's had highs and he's had lows. He was faithful to his king, and his reward was a spear. Tried to stick him to the wall. He had his king at his beck and call. He could have slain him there in that cave. And he stayed his hand. And just continued over and over and over. Think about when they had their entire families and all of the stuff, their wives, their kids, everything taken and stolen while they were out to battle, and they come back and find devastation at home. That was probably, honestly, the lowest point in David's life. He despaired even of life at that point. And yet the Lord brought him through it. Then we also see in David's life a good example of those when you follow sin. Because David wasn't doing what he wanted. He sought the pleasures of sin when he should have been out with the warriors, fighting the battle with his troops, leading his troops into battle. He stayed home, took the easy path, and had sorrow like he had never had sorrow before. Saw his child die for a little bit of pleasure. But the Lord walked with David, forgave David, brought him through that. Lord, when he sought God, he was commended for it and was lifted up. Let's turn over to, the chapter just left me. 1 Kings chapter 17. Correction, 19. In 1 Kings chapter 18, we've got one of the most wonderful stories in the Bible of God's victory over false prophets. It's the story of Mount Carmel when Elijah, he sets out the altar there and gives them a challenge and says, you build you an altar, pray to your God, and I'll build an altar and pray to my God. And the God that sends down the fire, that's the true God. And what do these false prophets of Baal do? They jump and they hoot and they holler and they cut themselves. And what are they praying to? A rock. And I just love the sarcasm of Elijah there when he's mocking them and saying, hey, maybe you should shout a little louder. Maybe he's sleeping, or maybe he's, gone off on something and he's just not paying attention. Could you imagine having a God like that? That you have to wonder, is he even hearing me? And then he goes and he takes that altar and he puts it on there, and then he pours the water over and pours the water over and pours the water over it. Basically makes it as hard as humanly possible and just speaks one short prayer. And what did God do? Fire from heaven. And that's his high point. And one of the things at camp, they always talk about, you have the mountaintop experience, but you can't take the mountaintop into the valley. And you can't live on the mountaintop. And Elijah comes down from there after the greatest victory, you could say, in his ministry, when the people clearly said, yep, God is God. Jehovah is God. And they slew the false prophets. And look in verse 1 of chapter 19. It says, and Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and withal how he had slain all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger unto Elijah, saying, so let the gods do to me, and more also, if I make not thy life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. He had a woman wanting to kill him for doing the right thing. And that was enough to take him from the mountaintop, from glorying in God, to the pits of despair. And when he saw that, he arose and went for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belonged to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a juniper tree, and he requested for himself that he might die, and said, it is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am not better than my fathers. Neither am I. And as he lay and slept under a juniper tree, behold, then an angel touched him and said unto him, arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was a cake baking on the coals, and a cruse of water at his head. And he did eat and drink, and laid him down again. Lord's taking care of him, even in the pits. And the angel of the Lord came again the second time, and touched him, and said, arise and eat, because the journey is too great for thee. And he arose and did eat and drink, and went in the strength of that meat 40 days and 40 nights unto Horeb, the mount of God. And he came thither unto a cave, and lodged there. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said unto him, what doest thou here, Elijah? And he said, I have been very jealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thine altars, and slain thy prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. Can you see the self-pity in that statement? Can you see the hurt and the anguish in that statement? How he's honestly saying that he's done everything God asked of him. He's done everything right. And he feels alone. He feels like he's the only one that's serving the Lord. And yet everything seems to be going wrong. Aren't we supposed to be on the winning side? But when you're in that pit, it can be hard to see the other side. And he said, go forth and stand upon the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains, and brake in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind, and after the wind an earthquake. but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. And it was so, when Elijah heard it, that he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entering in of the cave. And behold, there came a voice unto him and said, What doest thou here, Elijah? And he said, I have been very jealous for the Lord God of hosts, because the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thine altars, and slain thy prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And the Lord said unto him, Go, return on thy way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when thou comest, anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. And he gives him some instructions. And he tells him there, And Jehu the son of Nimshi shalt thou anoint to be king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel Meholah shalt thou anoint to be prophet in thy room. And it shall come to pass that him that escapeth the sword of Hazael shall Jehu slay, and him that escapeth from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha slay. Yet I have left me 7,000 in Israel, all the knees which have not bowed unto Baal, and every mouth which hath not kissed him. So we see Elijah in the wilderness. From the mountaintop in chapter 18 to the wilderness in chapter 19. He went from seeing God moving in a way that no one had ever seen in that generation to hiding in a cave in desolation and pity. And God sends the earthquake, and God sends the wind, and God sends all these big things. And yet where was God the whole time? The still small voice. God was right there with him. And Elijah was feeling like he was alone. That I could just imagine it going through his mind. Where is the God that sent the fire? I've been faithful to you, Lord. Why am I hiding in a cave now when I know you can do that? There's good times. There's bad times. Yet faithful through all of it is Jesus Christ. You've got a choice. And like I said, I'm not belittling the hard times. Because the reason I read so many different examples, and I didn't even touch on some of the obvious ones like Job or Joseph, some of the things that Abraham went through, I could go on. All the challenges they faced. The discouragements they faced. They had their good times, they had their bad times. And yet through it all, the Lord was faithful. And you know what we see so often is we don't know why the bad time comes. And if we go back far enough, it's sin. The consequences of sin. Not necessarily a sin in your life, but just the damage that sin has done to this world that Adam and Eve caused. That's the fruit of it. But God knows it's coming, and He takes us through it. Just from what Pastor said this morning, y'all are going through a rough time, and I don't know the full extent of it. And I don't need to know the full extent of it because He does. Can I be blunt? I would not preach this message if I didn't think y'all were pursuing the Lord. If I didn't think and believe that you have been trying to serve the Lord to the best of your ability. Choose affliction. Like I said, that doesn't sound all that encouraging. But what's at the end of that road? of pushing through for the Lord, pressing forward for Jesus Christ. There will come a day when you stand before Him. I mentioned Mrs. Greer that had terminal cancer. Had terminal cancer. While we were at Silver State on Friday, I got the news that she passed away that day. 2 weeks before that, a little over 2 weeks before that, she told one of our friends, she said, Karen, I'm going to see Jesus in 2 weeks. I'm ready to see Him. I'm ready to see my Jesus. Can I tell you what I've seen in her life over the last year? This is one of the most godly ladies I'd ever met. She has had an impact on people I couldn't even number them. And she had a very bad year this last year. But at the end of that road, there was Jesus. She came to her reward. She gave of herself for so many years, teaching kids. She had taught kids for generation after generation. For over 30, 40 plus years, she taught the kids in our church. And every one of them has just good things to say about her because of the influence she had in their lives. I've got a friend that's a preacher because of her influence. That friend I mentioned, Karen, her husband's a deacon and she's faithfully serving the Lord in her church because of the influence of Mrs. Greer. And all of that, and I could go on and on. I'm just scratching the surface of the impact that that one lady had and what she went through. That was hard. It was hard for us watching it. Knowing that here's a woman that loved the Lord and served the Lord, dying of cancer. But you know what? When she saw Jesus, it was all worth it. When we see Jesus, all of these adversities, all of these struggles, we're probably not even going to think about them. You know, every once in a while you'll see something on, I don't know if you all watch YouTube, things on YouTube. Every once in a while you come across something that's like, that's pretty good. And I saw this one where it said, here's what people think of heaven. And it showed the pearly gates and the streets of gold and all the mansions and things like that. And we'll get there and go, ooh and ah, this is what I have for eternity. And it said, this is what heaven is really like. And it was the person embracing Jesus Christ. Because you know what? When we get there, we're not going to care about anything but Him. Beeline straight to my Jesus. And all of these things that we go through in our life, you know, Jesus doesn't belittle them. He doesn't make light of them. In fact, go read the shortest verse in the Bible. Who can tell me the shortest verse? Brother TJ? Jesus wept. If you look at that verse in context, that is one of the most powerful verses in Scripture for the very heart of God. Because He's weeping because Mary and Martha's brother has passed away. And He sees their grief. And He already knows He's bringing healing. And yet He still says, I'm weeping with you. And He could have stomped on their toes for their lack of faith. And yet He doesn't. He shows compassion. He shows love. That's my Jesus. I know this isn't one of the normal sermons, so I'm not going to make a big appeal, make a change. I just want to leave you with some comforting. Keep on, keeping on. Those hard times, they come, but that's not a sign you're on the wrong path. In fact, quite the opposite. Seek after God. Remember that He loves you. And He has given us example after example of saints in the Bible who went through things just like we did, had those low times, and they struggled. And very, very rarely do you really see God come down hard on them. Even Elijah in that, he didn't come down that hard on him. He brought him fairly gently to show him his love and his encouragement and saying, I know it's the low point, but I'm right here. So, Ottawa Bible Baptist Church, keep on the path. I don't know, like I said, what I all have been through. I shared some of what our church has gone through to just share with my heart that I know what a hard time is like in a church where just everything seems to be falling apart. Things aren't going the way you'd expect them to go. But He's worth it. And He's faithful. And He wants to send a word of encouragement. Say, don't give up. Keep going. Press forward towards that mark. And once we've run our race, we'll get to look at Jesus. We'll get to see His wonderful face. And I pray, you know what I want to hear? In spite of all my failures, in spite of all the ways I've fallen short from what I should be, I want to hear, well done, thou good and faithful servant. I don't know what's between now and then, and I'm glad I don't know. Because I'll be honest, I'm weak. If I had known what was between when I was called as a 14-year-old boy and this moment, I might have turned back. There's been ups and there's been downs, but I'm so glad I've kept going forward. I wouldn't change a thing. Pastor?